You're listening to the Valley Current.
Imagine waking up, right, to find that the CEO of your company suddenly has this legal right to fire the independent auditors.
Oh, yeah, the people who are literally hired to investigate them.
Exactly. The compliance officers, the internal watchdogs, people whose entire job, relies on the fact that they cannot be fired on a whim by the boss.
Right. They're supposed to be insulated.
But suddenly, they are all serving at the absolute pleasure of that very same boss. I mean, if the CEO wants them gone, they're just gone.
It's a complete shift in the power dynamic.
Yeah, and on the morning of June 29, 2026, the United States Supreme Court effectively made a version of that exact scenario the law of the land for the American presidency.
They really did. It was a massive day.
2 monumental decisions came down on that single morning, and they fundamentally reshaped the legal architecture of the executive branch.
Rewired it completely.
So today's deep dive is tailored specifically for you, the listener, to cut through, honestly, the incredible amount of noise out there right now.
There is so much noise on this topic.
There really is.
Yeah.
So we are using a very specific, incredibly detailed source, the ELG Trump SCOTUS Executive Power newsletter, to understand exactly how the rules of our government have just changed.
It's a fantastic source for this because it gets right into the mechanics.
It does. Now, before we explore the mechanics of what just happened, I need to pause and address you directly.
Yeah, this is important.
Because we are diving into deeply political and highly charged constitutional matters today, involving both right-wing and left-wing perspectives. We want to make something crystal clear to you.
Absolutely.
We're not taking any political sides. Our mission is strictly to impartially report the facts and arguments laid out in our source material.
Right, we're just analyzing the text.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints. We are just your guides to understanding the legal architecture detailed in this briefing.
Just looking at the structural changes.
With that said, I'm joined by my co-guide through all this complex stuff. We share a common goal today, which is to look past the immediate headlines and explore how these dual rulings represent, really, a culmination of a decades-long legal movement.
It's been building for a long time.
It has. And we're going to trace how this fits into a historical ratchet of executive power that expands during times of crisis. Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a paradigm shift we are looking at. I mean, the foundational landscape of administrative law, that sort of hidden wiring that powers the regulatory state, dictating everything from antitrust enforcement to workplace safety, it was fundamentally rewired in a matter of hours.
Hours. That's crazy.
Yeah, and what is so compelling about our source material is that it doesn't just analyze the law in a vacuum.
Right.
It frames this entire era of constitutional litigation as a highly aggressive, overarching strategic negotiation playing out at the absolute highest levels of the federal government.
I definitely want to get into that strategy, but I think to understand the shift in presidential power, we have to look really closely at the exact events of the morning of June 29th, 2026.
We have to start there, yeah.
Because Chief Justice John Roberts authored 2 opinions that morning. And I'm looking at the aftermath of these rulings, and I am, honestly, struggling to reconcile them.
They do seem completely contradictory at first glance.
Right. They seem to point in completely opposite directions. So let's start with the massive expansion of presidential power. How did a 6-3 majority in Trump v. Slaughter legally justify stripping away regulatory protections that have stood for, nearly a century?
Well, to understand the justification in Trump v. Slaughter, we really have to understand the specific mechanism of the removal power. So the court ruled that the president could fire Federal Trade Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter at will.
Just at will, like pack your desk, you're done.
Exactly. And historically, since a landmark 1935 case called Humphrey's Executor, the heads of these independent agencies could only be fired for cause.
Right, meaning they had to have actually done something wrong.
Exactly. The president had to prove, inefficiency or neglect of duty or malfeasance. It was a deliberately high bar designed to protect these officials from purely political retaliation.
And Slaughter just completely dismantled that.
It demolished it. The 6-3 conservative majority ruled that these for-cause protections violate the separation of powers. They effectively argued that if the executive branch is going to function properly, the president simply must have unmitigated authority to remove the people executing the law on his behalf.
So the for-cause requirement is just gone.
Gone.
The president doesn't need to prove neglect of duty. They can just decide they want a new FTC commissioner on a Tuesday, and that's it.
Yep, at will means for any reason or no reason at all. And the ideological split on the court was absolute here. All 6 conservative justices voted to expand this removal power, and the 3 liberal justices dissented.
And Justice Sonia Sotomayor actually read her dissent from the bench, didn't she?
She did, yeah. And in the Supreme Court, reading a dissent aloud is a procedural signal. It shows profound fundamental disagreement with the majority's legal reasoning.
Yeah, and she used some incredibly striking historical language in that dissent. I mean, she stated that this ruling gives the president a power unknown even to the English crown against which the founders revolted.
Yeah, that is a heavy comparison. And it requires a bit of context to fully appreciate,
Right. Break that down for us.
Well, under the English monarchy leading up to the American Revolution, even the king faced certain structural limitations regarding the removal of established officers.
Really? Even the king couldn't just fire anyone?
Right, particularly those whose offices were considered a form of property or who were insulated by parliamentary statute.
Okay, I see.
So Sotomayor's argument is that the founders, who were obviously deeply suspicious of centralized monarchical power, they would never have designed an executive branch where a single individual wields absolute, unchecked firing authority over the vast apparatus of the state.
Because it would make them more powerful than the king they just fought a war to escape.
Exactly. She is arguing that the majority has engineered an executive more structurally dominant than King George III.
That is a staggering claim. But to play devil's advocate here and try to understand the practical reality of the majority's logic, the source material offers that analogy I mentioned at the top of the show.
The CEO analogy.
Right. Think of the federal government as a giant corporate entity. The president is the chief executive officer. And the argument goes, how can a CEO be in charge? How can they execute the vision the shareholders, or in this case the voters, elected them to execute if they don't have the legal authority to fire their own employees?
It makes a lot of intuitive sense when you frame it that way.
Right. If an employee is fundamentally blocking the CEO's agenda, the CEO has to have the power to replace them.
Right. That is precisely the mechanical logic underpinning the majority's decision. It relies entirely on the concept of a unified chain of command.
A unified chain.
Yes, because the president is the only executive official elected by the entire nation. The FTC commissioner is appointed.
So they don't answer directly to the voters.
Exactly. So if the appointed official can just defy the elected official, the majority argues that democratic accountability is completely severed. The voters cannot vote out the FTC commissioner. They can only vote out the president.
Okay, so the buck has to stop with the person the voters can actually fire.
Right. So if the president is to be held responsible for the actions of the executive branch, he must have total control over it.
But let me push back on that corporate analogy, because it feels like it has a massive blind spot to me.
Let's hear it.
Well, a massive publicly traded company isn't a dictatorship. It has internal checks.
Sure.
It has independent auditors, compliance officers, inspectors general, people whose entire professional existence relies on the fact that the CEO shouldn't be able to fire them on a whim.
The watchdogs.
Right. If a CEO can just fire the internal auditor the moment the auditor uncovers, financial mismanagement, then the auditor is completely useless. The whole system of checks and balances collapses.
And you have just articulated the exact structural tension that has defined American administrative law since 1935.
Really? That's the core of it?
That is the core of it. The fundamental question is, what is the nature of the agency's work? Are they just implementing the president's policy, or are they acting as a referee?
Okay, I like that framing. A referee.
Right, because the 1935 Humphreys executor precedent recognized that certain agencies, like the FTC, exercise quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions.
Meaning they aren't just purely executive.
Exactly. They investigate, they hold hearings, they levy fines, they act like a court in many respects. So the Supreme Court in 1935 said you cannot have the president holding a sword of Damocles over a quasi-judicial officer because it destroys their ability to be an impartial referee.
So Humphrey's executor was basically the legal shield protecting the referees. It allowed them to call balls and strikes without fearing the wrath of the team owner.
Exactly. And Slaughter just took a sledgehammer to that shield.
Wow.
By overruling Humphrey's executor, the court has decided that the referee concept is just unconstitutional if it infringes on the president's Article II powers.
So what does that mean practically? Who is vulnerable now?
Practically everyone. Because of this ruling, The heads of the FTC, the National Labor Relations Board, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission.
A whole alphabet soup.
The entire alphabet soup of the independent regulatory state now serves at the pleasure of the president. The CEO can now legally fire the auditors.
Okay, that is a sweeping tectonic shift in how the government operates.
It really is.
But this brings us to the whiplash of that morning.
Yeah.
Because you have the sixth of the ruling expanding power over almost the entire bureaucracy. But there was a second ruling released on June 29, Trump v. Cook.
Ah, yes, the other side of the coin.
And this one went in the exact opposite direction. How does the court justify stripping independence from the FTC, but preserving it in this case?
Well, Trump v. Cook introduces a massive structural carve-out to the new rule. In a 5-4 decision, the court blocked the summary firing of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook.
The Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States.
The one and only.
The entity that functionally dictates the cost of capital, controls interest rates, and manages the money supply. Why was the administration trying to fire a Fed governor in the first place?
Yeah, it's a wild story.
The source mentions an allegation about mortgage paperwork from 2021.
Right. So the pretext for the removal was a set of disputed allegations regarding mortgage application paperwork for her primary residence years prior.
For her own house.
Yes. The administration attempted to use this as cause to summarily dismiss her from her 14-year term on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors.
Just kick her out based on old mortgage paperwork.
Exactly, but the Supreme Court stepped in and said no. They ruled that the president cannot summarily remove a Fed governor on a hurried, factual contested pretext without providing formal notice, a transparent hearing, and a legitimate opportunity to respond.
So they essentially forced a procedural roadblock.
They did.
But the lineup of the justices in this 5-4 decision is what really stands out to me. The conservative supermajority completely fractured.
It fractured significantly. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh crossed the ideological aisle.
Wow.
They joined the 3 liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, to form a 5-4 majority that preserved the structural independence of the Federal Reserve.
So they basically said the Fed is different.
Right. They determined that the unique macroeconomic function of the central bank requires a level of insulation from immediate presidential control, and that the procedural rights of the governor must be respected.
A 5-4 decision to save the central bank released on the exact same day as a 6-3 decision handing over the rest of the regulatory state. That is wild.
It's historic.
Where did the other conservative justices fall on the Fed case?
Well, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a fiery dissent, and he was joined by Justices Alito, Gorsuch, and Barrett.
What was his argument?
Thomas argued that the alleged mortgage irregularities were more than sufficient to constitute cause for removal. But he went much further into the constitutional theory.
Of course.
He argued that the very policy arguments used to justify an independent banking agency, the idea that monetary policy is too important to be left to politicians, are fundamentally arguments against the design of the Constitution itself.
Meaning the Constitution doesn't allow for an independent economic branch.
Exactly. In his view, the Constitution does not allow for a fourth branch of government that controls the economy, but answers to no one.
What's fascinating here is the stark asymmetry of how the law is being applied to the individuals involved.
It really is.
You have the institution of the Federal Reserve winning a massive victory. It maintains its protective bubble. But Lisa Cook, the individual, is left in a very precarious position, isn't she?
Yes, she is.
Our source points out a glaring disparity regarding legal immunity.
What's fascinating here is exactly that asymmetry, and it highlights the complex mechanics of constitutional law. To understand her position, we have to look back at a ruling from 2 years prior.
Okay, take us back.
In 2024, in Trump v. United States, the Supreme Court established that the president enjoys broad, presumptive criminal immunity for official acts taken while in office.
Right, the big immunity case.
Exactly. The executive is insulated from prosecution for exercising their core constitutional powers. Lisa Cook, however, enjoys no such absolute immunity.
Because she is an appointed officer, not the president.
Right. She won a procedural victory at the Supreme Court. The justices said she couldn't be fired in that specific summary manner. But that procedural win at the High Court does absolutely nothing to clear her of the underlying mortgage fraud allegations.
So the allegations are still active. She still has to fight them.
She must still fight them. And she has to do it as a private citizen, funding her own legal defense without the shield of presidential immunity.
That is brutal.
It is. The Department of Justice could still pursue a criminal indictment against her based on those 2021 mortgage documents. So while the Federal Reserve as an institution successfully repelled a structural attack on its independence, Lisa Cook remains very much in the legal crosshairs.
When you step back and look at these rulings, I mean, a massive expansion of power in Slaughter, a narrow, highly specific check on power in Cook, the lingering threat of prosecution, it forces you to ask a broader question.
Which is?
Why are we seeing so many unprecedented constitutional questions reaching the court right now? Our source material provides a fascinating lens for this.
It does. It compares the administration's legal approach to a hostile corporate takeover or like a high-stakes business negotiation.
The art of the deal applied to constitutional litigation.
Exactly. It is a highly effective, albeit aggressive, legal strategy. In behavioral economics and negotiation theory, there's a concept called anchoring.
Anchoring. Okay, how does that work?
You enter a negotiation and make an initial demand that is incredibly high, just sweeping, unprecedented terms.
Like asking for $10 million when you really only want $1 million.
Right. You know, realistically, the other side will not concede to everything. But by anchoring the negotiations so far in one extreme direction, you shift the entire baseline of the conversation.
Ah, so you move the center.
Exactly. Even if you only win a partial victory or a compromise, that compromise lands far closer to your ideal outcome than if you had started with a moderate demand.
I see. You ask for the entire galaxy, they give you a solar system, and you're still light years ahead of where you started.
That's a great way to put it.
And when we look at the sheer novelty of the legal theories this administration is pushing, the anchoring strategy becomes incredibly obvious. The source material catalogs a list of absolute firsts, and it is staggering to see them all laid out together.
Let's run through that catalog because it perfectly illustrates the mechanical application of this anchoring strategy across different spheres of constitutional law.
Okay, first we have the 2024 case, Trump v. United States. The first time in American history a former president successfully argued for broad criminal immunity for official acts at the Supreme Court.
Right, unprecedented.
Then the attempt to fire Lisa Cook. The first time in the Federal Reserve's 111-year history that a president attempted to remove a sitting governor.
Another massive first.
We also have the administration being the first to attempt to end birthright citizenship, which is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment through a unilateral executive order.
Yep.
And then there's the Alien Enemies Act.
Oh, the Alien Enemies Act is a perfect example of this novel legal anchoring.
I mean, 1798. That's old.
It's ancient. This is a statute passed in 1798 during the John Adams administration amid the quasi-war with France. The text of the law allows the president to apprehend, restrain, and deport non-citizens who are from a hostile nation during a formally declared war.
But we aren't in a formally declared war right now. So how does the administration justify using a 1798 wartime statute in 2026?
Well, the legal mechanism they are attempting to use involves reinterpreting Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution.
Which says what?
It guarantees that the federal government will protect every state against invasion.
Okay.
So the novel legal theory argues that the influx of undocumented immigrants and the operations of transnational drug cartels constitute a literal constitutional invasion.
I see. So they are redefining the word to trigger the war powers.
Exactly. If the courts accept that premise, it theoretically unlocks the wartime powers of the Alien Enemies Act in peacetime, allowing for mass deportations without standard due process. It is a breathtakingly broad interpretation of an antiquated statute.
So no predecessor has ever pressed this many genuinely novel, boundary-pushing constitutional theories simultaneously. But an anchoring strategy only works if the other side eventually concedes ground. How is the Supreme Court actually responding to this onslaught of maximalist demands?
Well, if we evaluate the jurisprudence impartially, as our source requires, the administration's scorecard is genuinely mixed.
Really? It's not just a clean sweep?
Not at all. The aggressive positioning has yielded massive dividends, but it has also invited significant structural pushback. For every earth-shattering win, like securing criminal immunity or completely overruling the Humphreys executor precedent in Slaughter, the administration has suffered bruising defeats.
Let's talk about those defeats, because they are crucial to understanding the limits of this strategy. Our source highlights the battle over emergency powers tariffs. Explain the mechanism of how that failed.
Sure. Just months before the June rulings, the administration attempted to unilaterally impose sweeping across-the-board tariffs on imported goods. To bypass Congress, they relied on emergency economic statutes, primarily arguing that trade imbalances constituted a national security emergency.
But the Constitution explicitly gives the power of taxation and tariffs to Congress, right? Article 1, Section 8.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, struck the tariffs down.
6-3 against the administration.
Yes. The conservative majority essentially drew a hard line, stating that the president cannot use emergency statutes as a backdoor to usurp the article-way taxing power of the legislature.
So they do have a limit.
They do. Furthermore, there was a major loss at the lower federal court level involving the Federal Reserve. The administration attempted to issue subpoenas against former Fed Chair Jerome Powell, ostensibly as part of an investigation.
And what happened there?
A federal judge quashed those subpoenas, ruling that they were not part of a legitimate fact-finding mission, but rather an arbitrary and capricious pressure campaign designed to influence monetary policy.
So the courts are stepping in and actively neutralizing some of these power plays. The anchor-high strategy works to shift the Overton window of what is legally possible, but the judiciary isn't just handing over a blank check.
Precisely. These specific losses, the tariffs, the subpoenas, the Cook decision, prove that the current Supreme Court, despite its conservative supermajority, is not a rubber stamp for the executive branch.
They are actively judging.
Right. They are engaged in a meticulous case-by-case project of redrawing the boundaries of federal power. They are perfectly willing to grant unprecedented sweeping authority in one area of the law and violently slam the door shut in another.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have mapped out the strategy, we've tallied the wins and the losses. But what is the actual philosophical engine driving this entire movement? When the administration goes into court and demands the power to fire an FTC commissioner at will, what is the underlying legal theory they are citing to justify it?
The engine driving this entire jurisprudential shift is called the unitary executive theory.
The unitary executive theory. I have heard this phrase tossed around in academic circles and op-eds for years, but usually without a lot of deep explanation. Break down the actual mechanics of this theory for us. What is the textual basis in the Constitution?
Okay, so the entire theory rests on a strictly textualist interpretation of the very first sentence of Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which is known as the vesting clause.
And what does it say?
It reads, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America."
A president?
Singular.
Notice the singular phrasing. A president. It does not say the power is vested in a cabinet or a council or a series of independent commissions. It is vested in one individual.
Okay.
Furthermore, Article 2, Section 3 includes the Take Care Clause, which commands that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Okay, I follow the text. All executive power belongs to one person, and that person must ensure the laws are executed. But how does that philosophical reading translate into the mechanical right to fire an FTC commissioner?
The mechanical link is control.
Control over the people below them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Proponents of the unitary executive theory argue that if the Constitution vests all executive power in the president, then any official within the government who exercises executive power, whether they are writing environmental regulations, prosecuting federal crimes, or enforcing trade rules, is merely wielding a delegated fraction of the president's own power.
So they're basically just an extension of the president's hands. Yes. Therefore, the president must retain absolute, unmitigated control over those individuals to ensure they are executing his vision. And in administrative law, the ultimate foundational mechanism of control is the power of removal.
Because if you can't fire them, you don't really control them.
Exactly. If you cannot fire a subordinate, you do not truly control them. If you do not control them, the unitary executive theory dictates that the constitutional chain of command has been unconstitutionally severed.
This theory seems so dominant now, but this wasn't always the mainstream view of constitutional scholars, was it? How did it go from an academic concept to the law of the land?
Its evolution is one of the most fascinating arcs in modern legal history. For decades, it was considered a fringe, highly unorthodox idea, championed primarily by a small circle of conservative lawyers in the Justice Department during the Reagan administration.
So it started in the 80s.
Yeah, as a real movement. And it didn't gain a significant intellectual foothold at the Supreme Court until 1988 in a landmark case called Morrison v. Olson.
Morrison v. Olson. This was the case dealing with the independent counsel statute, correct?
Yes. In the aftermath of Watergate, Congress passed a law allowing for the appointment of an independent counsel to investigate high-ranking executive branch officials. Crucially, the law stipulated that this independent counsel could only be fired by the Attorney General for good cause.
Ah, there's that for cause phrase again.
Right. The Reagan administration argued this violated the separation of powers. The Supreme Court reviewed it and upheld the independent counsel statute in a 7-1 decision.
7-1.
Yes, effectively rejecting the unitary executive theory entirely.
So it was a massive defeat for the theory. But who was the lone dissenting vote?
The lone dissenter was Justice Antonin Scalia, and he wrote what is now considered one of the most prophetic and blistering dissents in Supreme Court history.
What did he say?
Scalia argued with pure unitary executive logic. He insisted that the power to prosecute is a quintessentially executive power, and any legislative attempt to insulate a prosecutor from the president's total control was a blatant violation of Article 2.
But he lost. It was 7-1.
At the time, in 1988, yes, it was a 7-1 defeat. Scalia was a lone voice in the wilderness. But fast forward to 2026, and the Slaughter decision has effectively vindicated him. Scalia's 1988 dissent has systematically become the governing architecture of the federal government.
That is an incredible generational evolution. From a near unanimous rejection to a 6-3 embrace. Now, our source material explicitly demands that we analyze this shift impartially. So I want to challenge you to lay out the best, most intellectually honest arguments for both sides of the unitary executive debate.
Let's hear it.
Why do proponents argue this is vital for the republic, and why do critics warn it is dangerous? Let's start with the proponents.
The strongest, most compelling argument for the unitary executive theory is democratic accountability. Think about the mechanics of an election.
Yeah.
The president is the only executive official elected by the entire voting population of the United States. When voters go to the polls, they are voting for a specific platform, a specific economic vision, a specific regulatory philosophy.
Right, they have a mandate.
Exactly. If unelected, anonymous bureaucrats entrenched within independent agencies have the power to stymie or ignore that agenda, and the president has no legal authority to remove them, then you have a profound democratic deficit. Power is being exercised without accountability.
So the voters get ignored.
The theory argues that democracy is fatally undermined if the elected leader cannot execute their mandate because the machinery of the state is insulated from the results of an election.
That makes perfect logical sense. I mean, if the voters elect a president who promises to deregulate the energy sector, but an independent environmental commissioner refuses to deregulate, the voters have no recourse.
Right, they can't fire the commissioner.
Only the president can fix it. But if the law prevents the president from firing the commissioner, the will of the voters is paralyzed. Okay, so what is the best argument against the theory?
The most robust argument against the unitary executive theory relies on the necessity of institutional expertise and stability.
Stability.
Yes. The counterargument insists that certain critical, highly technical functions of the modern state must be insulated from the volatile, short-term political pressures of the election cycle.
Think back to the auditing analogy.
Exactly. We want the officials who are auditing national elections or ensuring the safety of nuclear power plants or setting the baseline interest rates for the global economy to make their decisions based on empirical data, scientific consensus, and long-term stability.
Not poll numbers.
Right. We do not want them making decisions based on what will help the incumbent president secure swing starts in the next midterm election. If the president can fire the referee in the middle of the game simply because they don't like a valid call, the integrity and the factual reality of the game are destroyed.
So it becomes purely political.
The critics argue that total presidential control transforms objective regulation into pure political patronage.
And that profound philosophical tension brings us perfectly to the practical reality of the removal map as it stands today, in the summer of 2026. Our source material actually provides a legal flowchart to help visualize this.
It's a very helpful graphic.
After the Slaughter and Cook rulings, who exactly can the president fire and who is safe?
Well, the flowchart has been drastically simplified. The general default rule across the federal government is now at-will removal.
Meaning the president can fire them for any reason.
Yes. The president has absolute authority to fire the heads of the FTC, the National Labor Relations Board, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. All of these multi-member, historically independent commissions have been brought under the direct, unified command of the Oval Office.
With one glaring exception.
The Federal Reserve. Because of the 5-4 ruling in Cook, the Fed sits in what the source calls a category of one. It is the monumental singular exception to the new unitary executive reality. Its governors retain their for-cause protections and their 14-year terms.
I do want to clarify one technical detail from the source, though.
Yeah.
It mentions that while the regulatory agencies are now under presidential control, the court left an open question regarding non-Article 3 courts. What does that mean mechanically?
That is a crucial nuance. The federal judiciary, like the Supreme Court and the circuit courts, are created under Article 3 of the Constitution, and their judges have lifetime tenure. The president cannot fire them.
Right, judges are safe.
However, Congress has created specialized courts, like the United States Tax Court or military tribunals, which are technically housed within the executive branch under Article 1.
Oh, interesting.
The judges on these courts serve fixed terms and can historically only be removed for cause. The Supreme Court in Slaughter explicitly declined to rule on whether the president can now fire a tax court judge at will.
Wow, so that's just hanging out there.
Yeah. If the unitary executive theory is applied there, it creates a massive due process issue. Imagine a citizen suing the IRS and tax court, and the judge knows that if they rule against the government, the president can fire them the next day. The court recognized that friction and punted the question for future litigation.
That is going to be a huge fight down the road. But regarding the major economic and regulatory engines of the state, the Fed truly stands alone right now.
It does.
Which raises a huge historical question. Why is the central bank in a category of one? This structural carve-out doesn't seem random. Our source material connects this anomaly to a sweeping historical pattern of how American power expands over time. And when I read this section, it completely changed how I view government authority. Talk to me about the five-step ratchet mechanism.
This is perhaps the most vital conceptual framework for understanding American institutional history. We tend to think of executive power growing in a slow, steady, linear progression, but it doesn't.
It doesn't.
No, it grows in sudden, violent jumps, and those jumps are almost exclusively triggered by a systemic crisis. The source compares the evolution of power to a mechanical ratchet in a toolbox. A ratchet clicks forward under pressure, but its internal gears prevent it from slipping backward when the pressure is released.
Okay, walk us through the actual mechanics of those 5 steps. How does a crisis permanently alter the baseline of power?
The mechanism operates like this. Step 1. A massive crisis hits the system. This could be a kinetic war, a catastrophic economic panic, or a global pandemic.
Something terrifying.
Right. Fear grips the populace, the existing institutions fail to respond adequately, and there is a massive public demand for fast, decisive, centralized action.
Someone do something.
Exactly. Step 2. The president, utilizing the inherent speed of the executive branch, acts unilaterally to meet the crisis. Congress, either paralyzed by partisanship or eager to avoid blame, often formally delegates sweeping emergency powers or simply steps out of the way.
They let the president take the wheel.
Step 3. The crisis eventually peaks and begins to cool. As the immediate panic subsides, the courts finally have the breathing room to review the president's unilateral actions. They test the constitutional boundaries. Sometimes they uphold the emergency actions. Sometimes they strike them down as overreach.
And step 4 is where the ratchet actually engages.
Exactly. Step 4, the emergency power recedes. The president pulls back from the absolute dictatorial peak of the crisis response. But, and this is the critical mechanical failure of the system, the power never returns to its original pre-crisis level.
It settles at a higher baseline.
Yes. A new bureaucracy has been created, a new legal precedent has been established, or a new emergency statute remains on the books. Step 5. The cycle enters a dormant phase until the next crisis hits. But when it does, the executive branch starts its response from this new, elevated floor of authority.
I want to ground this abstract theory in concrete reality.
Yeah.
I want to walk the listener through how this ratchet mechanism maps onto American economic history, because our source explicitly links these leaps in executive power to what it calls the 6 industrial revolutions and busts.
It is an incredibly illuminating historical lens. Every time the American economy undergoes a massive structural technological transformation, it creates an unsustainable boom followed by a devastating bust. And every time the system busts, the federal government expands to pick up the pieces and regulate the new reality.
Let's trace that timeline. Let's look at the late 19th and early 20th century. The industrialization of America leads to rampant speculation, resulting in the panic of 1907. Total financial chaos. Banks run out of liquidity, the stock market collapses, and there is no central authority to stop it. what does that crisis birth?
The Federal Reserve Act of 1913.
Exactly. The creation of a massive new federal monetary power designed to provide an elastic currency. The ratchet clicks forward.
Exactly. Then the economy transitions into the mass production era of the Roaring '20s. Another massive boom, followed by an even more catastrophic bust, the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. The sheer scale of the economic devastation paralyzes the nation. What is the institutional response?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal.
Right. Congress delegates unprecedented authority to the executive branch, creating the alphabet soup of administrative agencies, the SEC, the FDIC, the FCC. The modern regulatory state is born out of the ashes of 1929. The ratchet clips forward again.
Then we can jump forward to a crisis we all lived through. The digital and financialization boom of the 2000s, leading to the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, yeah.
The housing bubble bursts, Lehman Brothers collapses, and global credit markets freeze completely.
And look at the mechanical response of the government in 2008. Congress passes TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. They essentially handed a blank check of $700 billion to the Treasury Department, granting the executive branch unprecedented authority to inject capital directly into private banks and effectively nationalize parts of the auto industry.
I remember that. It was staggering.
Then comes the Dodd-Frank Act, which fundamentally transformed the Federal Reserve. Prior to 2008, the Fed primarily managed monetary policy. After Dodd-Frank, the Fed was elevated to a vast systemic risk regulator, endowed with the power to stress test the largest financial institutions on Earth. Every bust leaves the executive branch holding more cards.
Which brings us to the present day. The source argues that we are currently litigating the expansion of power associated with the prospective AI bust of the sixth industrial revolution.
Yes.
The massive technological boom and the potential economic disruption of artificial intelligence is a chaotic backdrop for this current constitutional power struggle.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are literally watching the internal gears of the ratchet click forward in real time. The aggressive legal strategy, the fight over whether the president can fire the regulators who might oversee AI development, the battle over the Fed's independence to manage the economic fallout. This is the legal manifestation of our current era of structural economic anxiety.
The executive branch is positioning itself to manage the next crisis from a position of absolute, unchecked authority.
That's exactly what's happening.
And this historical perspective leads to my absolute favorite detail in the entire ELG briefing. When you look at the timeline, there is a 91-year symmetry that is almost too mathematically perfect to be real.
It sounds like something a screenwriter would invent for a political thriller, but it is documented historical fact. Let's go back to that foundational 1935 case we discussed earlier, Humphrey's Executor, the case that originally established the legal shield for independent agencies. Why did that specific case happen? What was the mechanical trigger? It happened because President Franklin D. Roosevelt, desperately trying to force his New Deal economic agenda through a resistant bureaucracy, decided to fire an FTC commissioner named William Humphrey simply because Humphrey opposed the New Deal.
FDR fires an FTC commissioner. The case goes to the Supreme Court. The court says, no, Mr. President, you cannot do that. And they invent the structural shield of the independent regulatory agency to stop him.
Exactly. Now, fast forward exactly 91 years to the summer of 2026, the Slaughter case. What was the mechanical trigger for this case?
It's crazy.
It happened because the current president, seeking to enforce a unitary executive agenda, fired an FTC commissioner named Rebecca Slaughter.
The exact same agency, the exact same mechanism of removal.
The exact same agency. But this time, 91 years later, the Supreme Court says, yes, Mr. President, you can do that.
Yeah.
And they completely destroy the very shield they created in 1935.
It's just wild.
The birth of the independent administrative state in the depths of the Great Depression and the death of the independent administrative state in the dawn of the AI era were both set in motion by a president deciding to fire a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission.
It gives you chills. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time analyzing the high-stakes chess match at the Supreme Court over who the president is legally allowed to fire. But while these cases drag on for years, how is the president actually governing on a day-to-day basis right now?
Good question.
If you are claiming all this unitary power, what is the mechanism you use to wield it when Congress is completely gridlocked? The answer, according to the data in our source, is the executive order, governing by the pen.
If the removal power is the president's grip on the throat of the bureaucracy, the executive order is the pen that writes the bureaucracy's marching orders.
I like that.
In an era of intense legislative polarization, where passing a major bill through Congress is nearly impossible, the executive order is the most direct, immediate mechanism to implement policy. It bypasses the legislature entirely and directly instructs federal agencies on how to interpret existing laws or allocate their resources.
Our source material lays out the data on executive orders, and to ensure a rigorous, impartial analysis, they normalized the data.
That's important.
Yeah, they didn't just look at total orders. They calculated the number of orders signed per month in office, which allows us to accurately compare a single-term presidency to an 8-year or even 12-year presidency.
That is the only statistically valid way to measure the velocity of executive action. What does the historical baseline show?
Historically, modern presidents, stretching from John F. Kennedy all the way through Joe Biden, encompassing both Republicans and Democrats, average somewhere between 3 to 7 executive orders a month.
So pretty consistent.
Yeah, the fairly tight, consistent cluster of administrative activity.
And how does the current administration's velocity compare to that historical baseline?
In his second term, as of mid-2026, President Trump is signing an astonishing 15.7 executive orders per month.
Wow.
He's crossed over 267 total orders in this term alone, 15.7 a month. To put that in perspective, that is more than triple his own first-term rate, which sat at a much more conventional 4.6.
And if we zoom out to the entirety of American history, where does a rate of 15.7 orders per month rank?
It is second only to Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR averaged 25.7 orders per month.
But we have to contextualize that, right?
Definitely. FDR was simultaneously navigating the absolute bottom of the Great Depression and the existential threat of World War II. Furthermore, Congress hadn't fully formalized the administrative rulemaking process yet, so he used executive orders for mundane administrative tasks.
Right, like assigning office space.
Exactly. So in the modern post-war era, a rate of 15.7 is entirely unprecedented.
It is a vivid, quantifiable metric of a presidency that is aggressively reaching for every available instrument of unilateral power. When the legislative route is blocked by a fractured Congress, the executive uses the pen to force the machinery of government to move.
But I want to ask you, and by extension the listener, to consider the structural reality of this approach. Governing by executive order is incredibly fast. You sign a document on the Resolute desk, the cameras flash, and the policy of the United States government instantly changes.
Very dramatic.
But isn't it also incredibly fragile? If an administration's entire policy legacy is built upon the foundation of executive orders, the next president, who might possess a completely opposing ideological worldview, can sit at that exact same desk on their very first day in office and undo the entire legacy with a stroke of their own pen.
In seconds.
Right. It is highly performative. It dominates the news cycle. But is it legally durable?
You have identified the core structural vulnerability of the modern unitary presidency. You can move incredibly fast when you move alone, but you are building your legacy on sand.
Because it can just be washed away.
Exactly. Enduring generational change, the kind that fundamentally alters the trajectory of a nation, usually requires the grinding, compromise mechanism of congressional legislation. Legislation is difficult to pass, but it is equally difficult to repeal.
It has staying power.
Right. An executive order is easy to issue, but it is vaporized the moment a new administration takes power. Furthermore, executive orders are legally fragile. They are constantly subjected to judicial review under the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning federal judges frequently issue nationwide injunctions to halt them.
So they get tied up in court anyway.
But if Congress is hopelessly deadlocked, the pen is the only tool the president has left to show momentum.
If the American executive is relying on the pen because the legislature is deadlocked, it begs a crucial question. Is this institutional breakdown uniquely American? Or are we clutching a global virus? While America wrestles with the expansion of its executive, what is the rest of the world experiencing?
The international data provided in the source is deeply sobering, and it provides a necessary comparative backdrop for the American legal drama.
What does the data say?
According to exhaustive data from the VDEM Institute and Freedom House, covering 2025 and 2026, the global political order has crossed a grim historical threshold. For the first time in over 20 years, autocracies now officially outnumber democracies worldwide.
Autocracies outnumber democracies. That is a chilling statistic.
Yes. And when you factor in population density, the reality is even starker. Roughly 72 to 74% of the global population, almost 3/4 of humanity, now lives under some form of autocratic rule.
3/4 of the planet.
Liberal democracies, which represent the freest, most structurally sound category of governance, are now statistically the least common regime type on the planet. We are witnessing 20 consecutive years of measurable global democratic decline.
So the global tide is undeniably pulling toward strong, centralized, unaccountable executive leaders. The immediate question is, how does the American constitutional struggle over removal powers and executive orders fit into that global trend?
Right. Where do we fit?
Our source impartially lays out two prominent scholarly views on this, and they arrive at starkly different conclusions.
View one is what political scientists call the democratic backsliding thesis. Scholars like Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt look at this global data and argue that the United States is not immune. Rather, it is actively sliding toward a model known as competitive authoritarianism.
Explain the mechanics of competitive authoritarianism. What does that actually look like in practice?
It is a hybrid system. It is a regime that maintains the facade of democracy. They still hold regular elections. They still have a legislature. They still have an opposition party. But the incumbent systematically weaponizes the machinery of the state to crush rivals and insulate themselves from accountability.
So the game is rigged, basically.
Exactly. They stack the courts, they purge the civil service of independent voices, and they use regulatory agencies to punish political opponents. Under this academic view, the events of 2026 fit the warning signs perfectly.
Expanding the removal power in slaughter to purge the bureaucracy, demanding total criminal immunity, attempting to bend the Federal Reserve to political will.
This thesis argues that these are not just legal disputes. They are the mechanical steps of a democracy in active decay.
That is a profoundly dark assessment of the American trajectory. What is view two?
View two is the institution's holding thesis. Other constitutional analysts look at the exact same sequence of events and reach the opposite conclusion. They acknowledge that American institutions are under immense historic strain, but they argue that the system's structural elasticity is working.
The institutions are bending, but they are not breaking.
Yes.
And what is the mechanical proof for that resilience?
Their primary proof is the very morning of June 29 we've been analyzing. They point directly to the Cook ruling. A conservative Supreme Court, partially appointed by the current president, looked at a direct, aggressive attempt to subjugate the Federal Reserve and firmly said no. They blocked the executive.
Okay, that makes sense.
Proponents of this view point to the emergency tariffs being struck down 6-3. They point to the federal judge quashing the subpoenas against Jerome Powell. Their argument is mechanical. If the United States were truly descending into autocracy, the president would win every single one of these structural cases.
Right. A true autocrat wouldn't lose in court.
The fact that the executive branch routinely loses massive high-stakes litigation proves that the constitutional system of checks and balances remains fully operational.
So we have the removal power expanding massively across the regulatory state, the central bank uniquely carved out, executive orders flying at an unprecedented rate, and a global geopolitical landscape tilting heavily toward autocracy.
It's a lot of pressure.
When you synthesize all these immense pressures, it brings us to the ultimate question about the umpires themselves, the United States Supreme Court. By splitting these two decisions on the morning of June 29, did the court save its own institutional credibility, or did it fatally compromise it?
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical institutional question of our time. To evaluate the court's strategy, we have to consider the counterfactual. Consider the road not taken.
What do you mean?
What would have happened mechanically, economically, and politically on that morning if the court had given the president a total, unqualified sweep? What if they had ruled, yes, you can fire the FTC commissioner at will, and yes, you can fire the Federal Reserve governor at will. The entire state, including the central bank, answers only to you.
If the court had handed over the Fed, I can only imagine the immediate reaction in the global financial markets.
The market reaction would have been violent and immediate. If global investors woke up to find that the Federal Reserve was suddenly legally subjected to the political whims of the White House, meaning the president could fire the Fed chair if they refused to cut interest rates right before an election, you likely would have seen an unprecedented panic.
Total chaos.
The value of the U.S. dollar would slip dramatically as confidence in its management evaporated. Treasury yields would spike as investors demanded higher returns to compensate for politically manipulated inflation risk.
Yeah, and what about the court's reputation?
Politically, the Supreme Court would have abandoned any pretense of judicial independence. They would be permanently labeled a pure, subservient rubber stamp for the executive branch.
So by issuing a split verdict, granting the president control over the administrative bureaucracy and slaughter, but erecting a firewall around the market-critical Federal Reserve in Cook. Did the court manage to navigate the crisis? Did they preserve their own legitimacy?
To understand the historical stakes of that specific question, we have to look at the mechanisms of how the Supreme Court has navigated previous moments of extreme executive pressure.
Right, because American history is punctuated by moments where the court either capitulated to the president or stood its ground. Let's start with the failures. When has the court deferred to the executive branch during a crisis, only to severely damage its own legacy?
The most infamous example, the one that serves as a permanent cautionary tale in constitutional law, is Korematsu v. United States in 1944.
Oh, the internment case.
Yes. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, amidst the panic of World War II, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, mandating the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans in internment camps.
Horrific policy.
But the policy was challenged and reached the Supreme Court. In a 6-3 decision, the court capitulated. They deferred entirely to the executive branch's claim of unreviewable military necessity. They applied a mechanism of extreme deference and blessed the internment.
And how did subsequent generations view that deference?
It is universally considered one of the most catastrophic moral and legal failures in the history of American jurisprudence. It was explicitly repudiated by the court decades later. The institution bowed to executive power during a moment of crisis, and it permanently scarred their institutional authority.
Okay, so that is the danger of deference. What about the flip side? When has the court actively confronted the president and emerged stronger?
The gold standard for judicial curry is Youngstown Sheet and Tube Copy Sawyer in 1952.
The steel mill seizure.
Exactly. During the Korean War, faced with a looming labor strike in the steel industry, President Truman issued an executive order to unilaterally seize the nation's steel mills, claiming inherent emergency powers.
Just took them over.
The Supreme Court reviewed it, and in a 6-3 decision, they struck it down. Justice Robert Jackson wrote a famous concurring opinion outlining a 3-part framework for analyzing executive power, firmly establishing that the president cannot bypass Congress even in an emergency.
So they checked the president and won.
Yes. Another prime example is United States v. Nixon in 1974. A unanimous 8-0 court forced President Nixon to hand over the Watergate tapes, legally declaring that the president's generalized claim of executive privilege cannot shield evidence in a criminal trial. In those instances, checking the executive built the court's long-term credibility.
So the intense debate happening right now is, which one of those historical parallels accurately describes the events of June 29, 2026? But before we can answer whether the court succeeded, we have to look at the empirical reality of where the court's standing actually is in the eyes of the American public. Our source includes some fascinating polling data from Gallup and the Marquette Law School poll.
What do the current metrics indicate about the court's legitimacy?
The numbers are grim for the institution. Overall Supreme Court approval is hovering near record lows. But the internal breakdown is more shocking. There is a massive 64-point partisan gap in approval ratings, meaning the court is viewed almost entirely through a polarized political lens rather than as an impartial arbiter.
That's a huge divide.
Furthermore, Marquette pulled the specific legal mechanism at the heart of the slaughter case before the decision was released. They found that 71% of the American public actively favored keeping the for-cause removal protections for independent agencies.
That is a vital piece of context. It means the court issued a massive structural ruling that fundamentally rewrote the government, a ruling that the vast majority of the public actively opposed, at a time when the court's overall approval was already deeply underwater.
So what does this all mean? Did the split verdict on June 29 ultimately help them or hurt them?
Well, the answer depends entirely on which of the two decisions you believe represents the real trajectory of the law. Supporters of the court's current conservative majority argue that the Cook decision is the defining moment.
Because they stood up to the president.
They argue it proves the court's genuine independence. By protecting the Federal Reserve, the justices averted a catastrophic market crisis and demonstrated they are not a rubber stamp. They view June 29 as a modern Youngstown, a measured, necessary check on executive overreach.
And how do the critics view the exact same day?
The critics argue that the Cook decision was nothing more than a modest, performative sideshow designed to placate the financial markets and create the illusion of balance.
Just a distraction.
Exactly. They argue that slaughter was the main event, a historically massive, structurally dangerous expansion of presidential power that dismantled a century of regulatory protections against the will of the public. They view slaughter as a modern Korematsu, a tragic deference to executive power that future generations of jurists will deeply regret. The ultimate verdict on the court's legitimacy, much like the final impact of these vast new executive powers, remains an open question that will take decades to resolve.
It is a phenomenal, almost overwhelming amount of constitutional architecture to process. We have traced a historical line from a fired commissioner in the depths of the Great Depression in 1935 to a fired commissioner at the dawn of the AI era in 2026. We've watched a lone 7-1 dissent by Justice Scalia evolve over decades into the undisputed law of the land. We are literally watching the foundational mechanics of the American government shift beneath our feet. As you step away from this deep dive, hold this question in the back of your mind. If you favor a strong, unaccountable executive branch in the abstract, are you prepared to live with that exact same power in the hands of someone you politically oppose? It's something to mull over.
Definitely.
Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at jack@computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we referred to is published in detail and readily available commitment-free with no paywalls or other charges.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.